You're watching CNN. I'm Julia Chatterley in New York. And the future of the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson could be decided in the coming hours. He faces a confidence vote later today. That's where lawmakers from his own Conservative Party will decide if they still want him as leader. It requires 180 votes to out Johnson as leader. That's a simple majority. Moments ago, Boris Johnson met with the Prime Minister of Estonia, Kaja Kallas, visited Mr. Johnson in Downing Street in the last hour. And we will bring you pictures of that engagement very shortly. For now, Nader Bashir. Oh, actually, we have those now. Here we go. And this was him earlier, meeting the Estonian Prime Minister ahead of that confidence vote.
The UK has been a very leading voice here also.
And Nader Bashir joins us now with all the details from Downing Street. Great to have you with us. A Platinum Jubilee hangover for the Prime Minister, it seems, this morning. No time to lose. I think the key point here is the numbers. It takes just 54 letters from MPs to trigger this confidence vote within the Confidence Party. It requires 180 of them now to say, look, we've had enough with him. How's it looking for the Prime Minister?
Well, look, Julia, it's certainly been a busy morning. We have seen already Conservative MPs, and particularly those senior ministers, coming out, some of them pledging their support publicly for the Prime Minister. We've heard from the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, we've heard from Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, and as well, we've heard from the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab. He actually spoke to UK media earlier this morning and said he predicts a very clear mandate for the Prime Minister from this vote of confidence. But as you mentioned there, it's that key figure. They need more than 50%. That's 180 plus one MPs to vote in favour of the Prime Minister. And that is significant for a number of reasons. There could be perhaps some support for him coming because we're seeing two very key by-elections coming up. They may not want to distract the focus away from that. We obviously saw the Conservative Party suffer some pretty significant losses in the local elections in early May. There's also, of course, a diplomatic focus on the war in Ukraine. This might not be the best time to look at a leadership challenge. And of course, there's the question of who would replace Boris Johnson. Even if there were a leadership challenge, there isn't a clear front runner in that instance. So that might dissuade Conservative MPs from voting against the Prime Minister. But of course, we have also heard significant opposition over the last few weeks and indeed over the last few months, and that rebellion has been bubbling on. The Prime Minister really coming under fire for his involvement in the Partygate scandal. That all-important Cabinet Office Sue Gray report was released just over a week ago and really gave a damning and full account of the extent of the parties and social gatherings which took place both here at Downing Street and also at other government buildings. The Prime Minister photographed several times at different gatherings at a time when the country was under strict COVID regulations. So he has certainly come under fire. The question now is whether that will be enough to push Conservative backbenchers and MPs to vote against the Prime Minister and trigger a leadership challenge. We've heard from Downing Street this morning. The Prime Minister has said he's welcomed the opportunity to put the distraction of the past few months behind him, to draw a line under this scandal. And that is certainly what he has been saying throughout these last few weeks and months during the Partygate scandal. But the question is now whether the MPs do want to draw a line, whether they want to move forward and focus on those policy priorities, as the Prime Minister has so often said, or whether it is time for a change and for a shake-up within the Conservative Party. Julia?
Yeah, you raise a great question. It's time to draw a line under this and move on. The question is, can they, even if he survives this? Nader Bashir, we shall see in the coming hours. Thank you for joining us there from Downing Street. Now, this vote comes hot on the heels of the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, marked by a weekend of extravagant celebrations that also highlighted Boris Johnson's flagging popularity. Just take a listen to this. That's the British public booing as the Prime Minister and his wife left a special Jubilee church service on Saturday this weekend. Max Foster joins us now with more on this. Max, I think a lot of people picked up on that booing and how popular or unpopular he's become. It's not just about Partygate, as Nader was suggesting there. There's a whole host of challenges that this government faces, indeed in terms of policy to react to the cost of living crisis that people are facing. In the court of public opinion, how does the British public feel about Boris Johnson and his future?
Well, you know, I was at St Paul's, I did hear that booing, but Then I went to other events. On Saturday night, for example, I was in a big crowd and Boris Johnson turned up and booing again. I mean, that is the sort of the trend, as it were. And on social media, you're seeing lots of negative words about him as well. But the polling's negative as well for him amongst the public. And I think this is going to be a really central theme in everyone's thinking as they go into that vote tonight, because, you know, there will be lots of ministers who will be voting. They will lose their jobs if they lose Boris Johnson, because there'll be a big shake-up, so that might make them want to vote for Boris Johnson. But there'll be others thinking ahead to the elections, and Nada was suggesting a couple that are coming up, but then the broader general election. If Boris Johnson is unpopular, then he could cost me my seat, and that's going to be the most damaging part to this for that vote tonight. But speaking to all the experts and various MPs, most people do feel that Boris Johnson might scrape through tonight. Then we end up with a question of how bad will this look for him and how much will it damage his credibility. So, you know, there needs to be 180 votes for him to lose the entire vote, and then he'd be expected to resign. But what if he, gets 100 votes against him? That's very damaging to him. And over the next year, he'll be protected for a year. There can't be another vote of confidence. That'll be a very rocky road for the government and the Conservative Party. So either way, it's all looking pretty negative for British politics.
Yes, it's going to be an interesting few hours. Max, great to have you with us. Max Foster joining us there from London. And just a reminder, that crucial vote takes place from 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 p.m. in London. We'll have more on this story later in the programme. And stay with CNN, of course, for all the latest updates throughout the day. For now, we'll move on. President Putin threatened Russian strikes on new targets if the West delivers longer-range weapons to Ukraine. He warns the deliveries will prolong the war.
In general, all this fuss around additional weapon deliveries, in my opinion, has only one goal: to drag out the armed conflict for as long as possible. If they are supplied, we will draw appropriate conclusions from this and use our own weapons, of which we have enough, in order to strike at those facilities we are not targeting yet.
Ukraine says the weapons could be a game changer in the battle in the east, and this is where Moscow is now focusing its attacks. The key cities of Slavyansk and Severodonetsk are under fresh assault this morning. In Severodonetsk, Ukraine reports street fighting and says Russia is sparing neither men nor equipment in its fight for the city. Ben Weidman joins us now. Ben, I want to focus in on what we're seeing in the east. We heard from the Ukrainian president last week saying that Russia now controls around 15% of the country. Fast forward to this weekend, and there was some suggestion that Ukraine was regaining territory in the east. Clearly there's fierce fighting. What is the latest status?
Well, yes, what we heard last week, Julia, was sort of by the end of the week that the Russians controlled about 80% of that city of Severodonetsk, which is about an hour and a half, 45-minute drive to the east of here. Over the weekend, Ukrainian officials say that they were able to regain some of that lost ground within the city. But today, Monday, the tide seems to have turned again, and the Russians are pushing the Ukrainians back. Now, what's interesting is that overnight, President Vladimir Zelensky actually came to the town of Lysychansk, which overlooks Severodonetsk, or rather he came to the area of Lysychansk. So they're clearly very concerned with the situation there. Ukrainian officials are describing how the Russians are pursuing their goals in that city as essentially scorched earth tactics. The problem, of course, is that there are still around 15,000 people in that city. And of course, given the intensity of the fighting at the moment, it's very difficult for any of them to get out. Julia?
Just part of the challenges, of course, that the country continues to face. Ben, I also mentioned the comments from President Putin about the prospect of the provision of longer-range weaponry to Ukraine and the risk that they would then tackle targets that perhaps they haven't done so before. We can question what he meant by that, whether it's in Ukraine or beyond. But if we're talking specifically about Ukraine, what might that mean?
Well, the goal of these are called high mobility artillery rocket systems. These I've read, it's like artillery with the precision of a sniper scope, and they fire long range missiles. So that would allow the Ukrainians to sort of counterbalance the advantage the Russians have in terms of artillery. The Russians, certainly in the eastern part of the country, and I've seen this myself, are using artillery on a massive scale. They're essentially, some of these towns, they're just completely flattening in order to just drive right through. So when the West, and of course we've heard the Americans are going to provide these weapons, and we heard from the British Defense Ministry that they would also provide these weapons, these would perhaps help turn the tide to fight, to sort of push the Russians back in the eastern part of the country. But really the problem is time is of the essence. It's very nice that the British came out and made this announcement today, but the Ukrainians want to know, that's great, fine, thank you very much, but when are the weapons actually going to arrive? Julia?
And weeks away perhaps from delivery. Ben Weidman, great to have you with us. Thank you. A combined show of force by the US and South Korea, the two countries launching 8 ballistic missiles into the sea after a North Korean missile test over the weekend. That launch was the North's 3rd missile test since South Korea's new president took office a month ago. Paula Hancock joins us now with all the details. Paula, it was 8 for 8, I believe. It reminded me of that song, Whatever You Can Do, I Can Do Better, or at least equal to in this case. We seem to be looking at rocket diplomacy, which ties, I guess, to a tougher stance from the new South Korean president who said, we're not going to stand for this.
Well, this is the true sense of the phrase tit for tat, isn't it, Julia? The fact that there were 8 on Sunday morning, local time from North Korea, and then 8 in response by the US and South Korea on Monday morning. Now, pointing out, of course, all of these were fired into the sea off the east coast of Peninsula, so it wasn't engaging either side engaging each other. But what is interesting is what we saw from North Korea is the fact that Japan's defense minister actually called it unprecedented. There were 8 missiles, short-range ballistic missiles, but they were all fired from 4 different locations, so multiple sites within about 40 minutes of each other. So that is North Korea stepping up what they are testing at this point. So that's why the US and South Korea felt the need to have what they call a show of force in response. Now, it's not the first time that it's happened. They also did this back on May 25th, the last time that North Korea launched missiles, and that was just after the US President Joe Biden had left the region. He was here in Seoul and also in Japan. And it has also happened with the previous administration, with the former South Korean President Moon Jae-in, but certainly not as often, as he was very much pro-engagement and pro-negotiation with North Korea. But it's not unheard of that this is the kind of response that we have from the US and South Korea. That JCS, the Joint Chiefs of Staff here in Seoul, saying that it is to show that they know exactly where these launches are coming from when they come from North Korea, and they would be able to target that particular location should they so desire. Julia?
And you make a very good point that these were all tests into water and not rockets directly fired at each other, and I just want to reiterate that point. But it also does come at a time when there are rising fears that perhaps North Korea is preparing for nuclear tests. And we've had comments even just today from the International Atomic Energy Agency also perhaps pointing in that direction too. Critically important to understand the timing.
That's right, yes. So the IAEA has said this today, that they believe that there are indications, they've observed indications, that one of the entrances to one of these underground tunnels, which is where the previous underground nuclear tests have taken place, has actually been reopened. And it could be for a possible preparation of a nuclear test. It's very similar to what we've heard from US and South Korean intelligence and military agencies saying that they believe actually the preparations are completed. That's certainly what we've heard from the South Korean side. In fact, the US side was saying they believed that it could have happened while President Biden was in the region. Now, it didn't, but what of course this tells us at this point, according to experts, is that if the preparations are ready, it is now up to the leader, Kim Jong-un, to make a political decision when and if he wants to carry out this 7th underground nuclear test. It would be a step up from what we're seeing at the moment. Missile launches, yes, they are condemned. Yes, there is some kind of sometimes physical response from the US and South Korea, as we saw in the early hours of this Monday morning. But a nuclear test is beyond that once again. In fact, the IAEA said that it would be a cause for serious concern reminding us once again it is a violation of United Nations Security Council resolutions, as are many of these ballistic missile launches as well. But certainly if there was number 7 of these underground nuclear tests, the repercussions could be far greater. Julia?
And the message is they're being watched, I think, to your earlier point, Paula Hancox. Thank you for that. OK, let me bring you up to speed now with some of the other stories making headlines around the world. In Bangladesh, a massive fire at a container depot has left at least 49 people dead and more than 300 injured. Officials say several firefighters have died trying to extinguish the flames, which have been burning at the facility since Saturday. The fire is mostly contained, but some of the chemical containers have exploded, complicating the operation. And close to 50 people were killed on Sunday after gunmen stormed a Catholic church in southwest Nigeria and opened fire, according to a local lawmaker. Authorities say they cannot yet confirm the total number of casualties, nor can they identify who is behind the attack. Stephanie Busari is in Lagos for us and joins us now. Stephanie, admittedly that's what the authorities are saying, but what more do we know, and what about hopes for working out who actually did this and finding them?
So, Julia, in the past hour, we've been speaking to officials in Nigeria, and they have said that they've counted more than 50 bodies. So, as we expected, the death toll in this gruesome attack will rise. We had initially 28 people at least, but now they're saying that's more than 50 people, and that is expected to rise. Still no clear indication about who was behind these attacks. In previous attacks, which have happened in the Northeast, it has similar kind of hallmarks with large groups of armed men on motorcycles storming a building and abducting and attacking people. So very similar. What is different here is that this part of the country is very, very peaceful. No previous incidences such as this have happened in this very peaceful and stable part of the country. And that has led to concerns that this is going to lead to more violence in different parts where we haven't seen it before, as the election primaries and election season ramps up. Also, I've been speaking to a woman whose parents sadly both died in this attack, and she said she has been to the morgue this morning and has seen a lot of elderly bodies and children who were the primary victims of this terrible attack, Julia.
Heartbreaking. Our thoughts and heart with all those people involved. Thanks for that, Stephanie. Great to have you with us. OK, straight ahead. The British Prime Minister's career hanging in the balance. We speak to one of the lawmakers deciding his fate. And Russia targets Ukraine's capital for the first time in weeks. We're joined by Kyiv's mayor to talk about the city's fight. Stay with us. Welcome back to First Move. It's the start of a new week on Wall Street. US stocks look set to open higher for the first time in a few sessions now. What we saw last week's pullback with the tech in the lead. That's the picture that we're seeing at this moment, higher by 1.6% for the Nasdaq. Europe, as you can see on the board there, also in the green. A solid Asian session too. The Hang Seng rallying almost 3%. A relative outperformer, in fact, the Hang Seng this year compared to other major indexes. It's down some 7.5% compared to an almost 8% drop for the German DAX and a 13% drop for the S&P 500. Just to give you some context there, Hong Kong higher today as COVID lockdowns begin easing in Beijing. Indications that China's almost year-long crackdown on tech may be winding down too. The Wall Street Journal reporting that Beijing is wrapping up its national security review of the ride-hailing app Didi and other tech firms. Didi will reportedly be allowed back on Chinese app stores and will be allowed to sign up new users once again. The big question, of course, is whether more benevolent Beijing changes Didi's decision to delist from the United States and relist in Hong Kong. I'll give you one guess. China's outlook, just one uncertainty that has Wall Street raising the alarm on the global economy. BlackRock CEO Larry Fink telling Bloomberg he expects inflation to remain high for years, partly because of the disruptions in the global supply chain. And just last week, JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon warned investors to brace themselves for an economic hurricane. And add in Elon Musk telling executives at Tesla that he has a, quote, super bad feeling about the economy and will reevaluate hiring at the electric car maker. Inflation, the central theme of CEOs and investor concerns. The latest US inflation report is due out later this week. Now joining me to discuss all of this, and it's a lot to get through, Troy Gajewski. He's Chief Market Strategist for FS Investments. Troy, fantastic to have you on the show. What did you make of the comment about the economic hurricane? Does that tie with your level of concern, or at least the level of uncertainty at this moment?
Well, I think if you go back to coming into this year, Julia, and by the way, good to see you again. It's been too long. The main focus for investors was how to manage through an environment where the economy stayed relatively strong, but you would have significant multiple compression, which would affect equity markets as well as higher bond yields, because inflation was going to run hotter and the Fed would have to tighten money supply and monetary policy. And then, of course, we had two really negative shocks, right? First, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then secondarily, China's bizarre COVID zero policy, which had put additional pressure on supply chains. So that was the initial concern. Unfortunately, what you're seeing now is some concerns over global growth and U.S. growth. The U.S. consumer, Julia, is very mighty, right? They have tremendous balance sheet wealth built up from the pandemic. You still have a hyper tight labor market. But basically what guys like Jamie Dimon are saying is the U.S. consumer can't keep the global economy going single-handedly. They need some help from CapEx and business fixed investment. They need some help from China, need some help from Europe. And so recession risk was exceptionally low coming into the year. And unfortunately, that has appreciated substantially because the U.S. consumer just can't do it single-handedly.
It's such a great point, and I think the focus comes down to perhaps two different scenarios, and it's the one that we heard the BlackRock CEO talking about, which is that inflation remains sticky and it stays high for a long time and we're battling it for whatever reason, and then perhaps the other one where the Federal Reserve in particular, but obviously other central banks around the world are trying to tackle the pricing pressures too. They managed to do that, but the consequences, significantly tighter rates and a reduced balance sheet sucking out some of the liquidity, means recession risk, higher recession risk, if not recession. Is that the sort of two most likely scenarios that we're looking at here?
Well, there still is the third, which is that the Fed can thread the needle and the consumer can keep chugging along and we get business fixed investment and China avoids or evolves away from a counterproductive policy right now.
Is that
but
lower probability though?
100%, Julie. That's the problem, is the probability of that outcome has declined substantially. And the probability of sustained inflation, because now we're in a full-blown wage price spiral. And unfortunately, if the Fed had tackled this a little bit earlier, we might not be there. But that probability is uncomfortably high. And then alongside that, you've now had an increased probability where the Fed really does what it takes to break inflation. but eventually the consumer can't keep it going single-handedly because financial conditions, equity multiples, interest rates, credit spreads tighten so much. You never get that follow through on business fixed investment and CapEx, which we've all been expecting. And we have a fairly mild recession, call it later this year or early next. That's still not our base case. We're trying to be very balanced in terms of, these three potential scenarios. But unfortunately, as the needle threading scenario has diminished, the probability of recession has increased marginally.
How do you handle, or how do you invest to handle all of these kind of scenarios, whether you're an individual investor or a fund? Because one of the big challenges this year, and it plays to the point that you were just making, is that we've seen stocks, at least for indices, go down, and we've seen bond yields rise. So that means bonds have gone down. So your traditional safe haven in that environment has disappeared. Where are the safe havens, even if we're just talking about capital preservation, never mind capital return? And we'd love some returns too, please, Troy, if you can solve that problem for us as well.
Yeah, I'll come through like a champ, No, but
yeah, please.
For firms like ours that have been democratizing alternatives for over a decade, really pleased that there are a variety of alternative investments now that protect capital, can benefit from the Fed hiking because the majority of the assets are floating rate, and can also mitigate downside in the event of a surprise recession, which is becoming less of a surprise, or if we stay in a higher inflationary environment. So one of the first areas would be senior secured commercial real estate debt, where you have a tremendous economic resilience because you're in the senior part of the capital structure, and you benefit to some extent by the Fed hiking because the majority of the assets are floating rate. So that would be, very stable NAV, grind out a consistent return, mid to low high single digits, and not deal with all the drama. And furthermore, in all three of those scenarios, you should expect a positive return. You're never going to make 12 to 15% in a given year, but that's not what this year is all about. That's point one. Point two is, if you can tolerate a little bit more mark-to-market volatility and can live with some drawdown risk in the event of a recession, if you look at business development corporations like FSK, they have over 12% dividend yield and trade at a significant discount to NAV. So you can get a very attractive total return story, albeit with more volatility. And then lastly, Julia, in multi-strategy hedge fund strategies, or like our multi-strat product, volatility is actually our friend, because as market dislocations go up, we can do a lot more relative value trades to take advantage of those dislocations. And so there are a handful of safe havens. We're not arguing it's going to be easy when equities are struggling and fixed income struggling, but there are ports in the storm in an environment like this to make a decent return, at least keep pace with inflation, and make sure if we get any one of those three scenarios, you at least have a fighting chance to make some return.
Yes, and I think the overriding message there is stay calm and expect volatility. Troy, always great to chat to you. Thank you so much. Troy Gajewski there, the Chief Market Strategist for FS Investments. We'll see you soon. Thank you for that. And the Market Open is up next. Stay with us. Welcome back, and a reminder of one of our top stories this hour, the future of the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson hanging in the balance. The UK leader faces a vote on his leadership of the Conservative Party later today, after at least 54 lawmakers from his own party said they no longer have confidence in him. And as the vote approaches, senior members of his cabinet have been voicing their support on Twitter, the likes of Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, Chancellor Rishi Sunak and Michael Gove, all saying Prime Minister Johnson should stay in the top job. Even if he survives tonight's vote, opposition leader Keir Starmer says the writing is on the wall. Take a listen to this.
I think history tells us that this is the beginning of the end. If you look at the previous examples of no confidence votes, even when Conservative Prime Ministers survive those, and he might survive it tonight, the damage is already done.
I suppose you would expect nothing less from the leader of the opposition, but joining us now is Daniel Kawczynski. He's a member of Parliament for Boris Johnson's Conservative Party. Sir, great to have you on the show. Can I ask if you are one of the 54 potentially plus members of Parliament that have written a letter saying they no longer have confidence in the Prime Minister?
Well, I think when members of Parliament do write in to Sir Graham Brady, that is a confidential matter, and I certainly don't discuss those things with the media. What I would say is that I very much hope that the Prime Minister does win the vote today in the House of Commons. We have increasing problems facing our country, whether it's the situation with Ukraine, whether it's very high inflation and trying to rectify the economy after the pandemic. It's a difficult time for our country, and to have a change of leadership at this time I don't think is optimum.
So your view is that he remains an asset rather than a liability, both to the country and the government?
Well, I'm speaking to you from London, which is a very left-of-centre city and a city where all Conservative politicians have struggled over the last 20 to 30 years. Boris Johnson is the only Conservative politician who has won London, and not just won it once, but won it twice. And when he finished being Mayor of London, he had a very high reputation as having done the job extremely well. The thing that matters for me is, and the reason I voted for him to be leader of the Conservative Party and ultimately Prime Minister, is his promise to deliver Brexit. Let's not forget the chaos and mayhem that we saw in this building behind me in 2019 when the previous Prime Minister could not implement the decision of the British people who voted for Brexit. That was a very, very difficult and painful time, and it was Boris Johnson's leadership and courageous approach that finally managed to resolve that issue. So I think that, plus the fact that he's got a majority for us, the biggest majority since 1987, of over 80 majority in the House of Commons, are things that are very relevant in assessing his continued leadership of our party. And if you are going to throw your captain overboard halfway along the journey, you need to be pretty damn sure that you've got somebody better to steer the ship. And I don't see anybody else who has the credibility of doing a better job than the current incumbent.
Do you think that's the view of the entire party? That at this moment, whether or not he's the best man for the job, he's the only man to continue, given a lack of available alternatives that perhaps can do a better job?
Well, I think in any organisation, you will have whatever corporation or organisation you work for, there will be a certain number of people who are not happy with the leadership for various reasons. We now have a contest because 15% of the parliamentary party have called for a vote of confidence following the Sue Gray report. I'm not going to get into a confrontation with my colleagues who won't have a vote of confidence. That is their right. And from an emotionally intelligent perspective, we need to try to understand each other's perspectives. The most important thing, however, though, is that when we know the result tonight, that the whole of the parliamentary party comes together again and accepts the result. Because one thing I can guarantee you, divided parties do not win elections. And ahead of the next general election, which is due in 2 years' time, we really need to put this Partygate issue to bed, resolve it one way or another, and move on and focus on the things that affect people's day-to-day lives, whether it's the economy, whether it's jobs, or whether it's inflation.
I think that's what the British people surely want too. I mean, Partygate just one of a whole host of issues that the government should be focusing on, and perhaps not this. Daniel, how long does he survive? even if he wins this confidence vote? And should he be the leader of the party going into the next election, in your mind?
Oh, I think that if he let's wait and see what the result is. But I'm quietly confident that 3/4 of the parliamentary party will support him this evening. If that is the case, then he will survive, and he will not only survive but lead us into the next general election campaign. The one thing which your viewers ought to know is that we've been in office now for 12 years. And to be behind in the opinion polls by only 7%, some opinion polls put us just 6 points behind Labour, is an astonishing feat. Normally, at this time of the Parliament, a governing party, if you look at the opinion polls historically, will be 10, 15 points behind. So I don't think the British people are convinced by the opposition, by Sir Keir Starmer, and I think there is everything to play for at the next general election in 2024, and I very much hope it's under the leadership of Boris Johnson.
Daniel, that doesn't half feel like a consolation prize. Quite frankly, one would rather be ahead than not quite so far behind as perhaps previous governments. We can debate that point again. Very quickly, who's the best backup? Should the Prime Minister lose this vote, in your mind? Who is the best backup to the current Prime Minister?
That's a speculation, of course, and I hope you will allow me just to focus on the vote in hand today before making any further speculations. I do have somebody in mind who would be a potential credible alternative, but at the moment the focus is making sure that we vote in the elections today and understand what the magnitude of the vote is. If, as I predict, 3/4 of the parliamentary party support the Prime Minister, then I think he will be safe. The rules say that there is no contest allowed, permissible, for another 12 months, by which stage we are moving into the domain of getting ever closer to the next general election. So tonight's vote is absolutely crucial. Crucial for the Conservative Party, crucial for the country.
And sir, I would ask you what that name is, but I know exactly what you're going to say to me, in which case I won't bother asking. We'll focus on the matter at hand. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your time. I know it's a busy day.
Thank you very much.
Member of Parliament for the Conservative Party there. Thank you, sir. All right, up next, Russia's first strikes on Kyiv in weeks rattle Ukraine's capital. We speak to the city's mayor. Ukraine says President Volodymyr Zelensky visited the war-torn east of his country as the battle for the Donbass rages. On Sunday, President Zelensky reportedly visited frontline troops near the critical city of Severodonetsk. That visit comes as Ukraine says Russia is putting its full military might into the battle for the east. On Sunday, military officials reported Russian troops had suffered losses in the Donetsk region amid a push towards the key city of Slavyansk. In Severodonetsk, Ukraine reports the fiercest battles, quote, and street fighting after it retook half the city over the weekend. Sunday also saw the first Russian strikes on Kyiv in weeks. Ukraine says 5 missiles were launched at the capital. 1 military target and 1 civilian target were reportedly hit. Joining us now is Vitaly Klitschko. He's the mayor of Kyiv. Mayor Klitschko, good to have you on the show. We appreciate your time. I want to ask you about the missile strikes that we saw on Kyiv over the weekend. The Russians said they were targeting and destroyed foreign-provided tanks. Obviously, the Ukrainian forces have said it was a train repair operation. Can you tell us what happened?
Good afternoon. In Kyiv, we have already afternoon. Actually, just yesterday we have rockets attack. His 6 rockets launched and destroyed the buildings. The Russians told this was military object. It's totally a liar, and it's not true. It's thanks God nobody died, but a couple of people was injured. Was in spent right now the time in hospital. It was civilian infrastructure objects, and they don't have connection to military forces. And like always, the Russians explain the liar regarding this special operation.
So just to be clear, no tanks that were provided by Eastern European nations were destroyed in this attack?
In Kyiv, it doesn't have tanks. It was destroyed civilian buildings.
I got it. You've been honest and you've said to people you understand their desire to come back to Kyiv, but they do so at their own risk because the situation still isn't stable. And this rocket attack, I think, proves that. What impact does it have on people's mentality, people's fears?
Kyiv, capital of Ukraine, was the target and still the target of Russians. And the main priority to occupy the capital of Ukraine always was the goal of Russian Federation, of Mr. Putin. And right now, thanks to Ukrainian military forces, to Ukrainian warriors, soldiers, who actually defend our city, and Russians right now concentrate his forces to the east of Ukraine, but Kyiv still the target. We see the rockets attack. Actually, before the war, its population of our city was 3.6 million people. 3.6 million citizens. During the war, our population reduced to 1 million because women, children left the city, and slowly right now, when the Russian soldiers go away from capital of Ukraine, the people coming back to homes. Right now, the population Kyiv around 2.5 million citizens, and people coming back. And right now, actually, if we can call that normal life, the cafe is open, some small business starting to work. Right now, beginning the summer, the people coming back to hometown, but every day we listen the warning regarding rocket attack, and everyone have to go to the bunkers. A couple of times a day we listen the alarm.
Yeah, the fear remains. One of the other things that I think people need to understand is something that the emergency services, the Ukrainian emergency services estimate, which is that half the country now has unexploded ordnance. So that remains a risk even for people returning wherever they are in the country. And I know you and your brother run a foundation that was created to give sporting access to young people. And now you've switched and you're providing education on this kind of unexploded ordnance, on critical first aid if people are caught in an attack and trying to make instant decisions to save lives. Mayor Klitschko, even just saying it is heartbreaking to me that that's what children are now learning.
This situation have a huge and long impact on the citizens of our city. It's one of the reasons why I tell to everyone, please not so fast coming back, because the north of east of our city, the woods and green zone was totally with the mines and unexploded stuff. And we have couple of examples, couple of cases, not examples, sorry, cases when civilian already died. And that's why this zone is forbidden to visiting the green zone. It's actually the people make a barbecue to the green zone. It's if a good weather to spend in weekend, but right now we close all green zone because it's very dangerous. Yes, of course, we have to do it a lot. Anti-mine program. Actually, we need the experts to do that. But right now, in still the war, it's difficult to do it because everybody concentrate to support the Ukrainian army and to defend our country in the east of south of Ukraine. But anyway, this is one of the reasons why I told to everyone, please, if you come to the Kiev, it's your personal risk, the own risk. Following the rules, please following the rules. We actually every day announced what is allowed to doing, what is not.
Mayor Klitschko, you and I were both in Davos just over a week ago, and one of the discussions taking place there was the concern that the rising food prices, the rising energy prices, the complications of this war might force some countries' leaders around the world to take a look at the situation in Ukraine and decide to perhaps persuade or say to the Ukrainian government, we need to compromise here. For the good of the world, there needs to be some kind of compromise and the war must come to an end. And I saw the comments from President Macron at the weekend where he said President Putin shouldn't be humiliated in the negotiations that are taking place. Mayor, what do you make first of President Macron's comments and some of those conversations that perhaps could force a compromise?
If we listen about the words the Russians told us, let's find a compromise, let's find solution. I don't know what they talk about. What we talk about, which compromise to give up to Russians some big part of territory of Ukraine, it's compromise or is solutions in some politician, for example, is Macron. I was really, as Ukrainian citizens, I was very disappointed, upset from his messages. Is actually Ukrainians attack, they kill our citizens. The big part of Ukraine was occupied, and the Russian Federation not accept Ukraine as country and us Ukrainian as nationality, as is actually the people have to understand, we defend our country, we defend our future, we defend our families and our children, and also we defend the same value and principles what have European country, which have democratic countries. We fighting for you, for every one of you, because the principles and values is the main priority right now. We in the modern world, and we can't accept some compromise. I don't know what we have to talk about. We ready to talk about compromise or solution if the last Russian soldier left our country, and after that it's time to talk. Right now it's difficult to talk if every day killed Ukrainian, and big part of Ukrainian country was occupied.
I think the message
doesn't
there,
have
sir,
another
is
solution.
no surrender.
Yeah, you're right.
Mayor, great to chat to you. Thank you for your time, and we'll speak again soon, I hope. The Mayor of Kyiv there. So thank you. We're back after this. Stay with us. A warm welcome back and a better tone on Wall Street this Monday. There it is, early hours. Tech stocks in the lead in early trade after last week's 1% Nasdaq fall. Lots of challenges for investors to overcome this week, including Friday's all-important read on US consumer price inflation. Take a look at shares of Twitter in the meantime, lower in early trade as Elon Musk accuses the company of withholding data on bots. Musk is now saying he may withdraw his takeover bid. One to watch. That's it for the show. If you've missed any of our interviews today, they will be on my Twitter and Instagram pages shortly. You can search for @JChatterley CNN. In the meantime, Connect the World with Becky Anderson is up next, and I'll be back tomorrow.
threshold of 15% of the parliamentary party seeking a vote of confidence in the Prime Minister has been passed.
Well, it's crunch time for Boris Johnson. Can the British Prime Minister survive a confidence vote by his own party lawmakers? More on that is coming up. Plus,
I am proud of everyone I met, shook hands with, communicated with, and supported.
Ukraine's president on the front lines with his troops just kilometres away from the fierce battle over Severodonetsk. And well, a show of force. The US and South Korea responding to 8 missiles launched by Pyongyang with 8 of their own. 3 p.m. in London. I'm Becky Anderson. Hello and welcome to Connect the World. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is fighting for his political life, trying to fend off a potentially lethal blow from his own party. Now, in the coming hours, Mr Johnson will face a vote of confidence. This has been triggered by discontented lawmakers from his own party, the Conservatives. Confidence in the PM's leadership has been shaken by the so-called Partygate scandal and his response to a cost of living crisis. Plus, this didn't help. Mr Johnson and his wife Carrie booed during the Queen's Platinum Jubilee celebrations over the weekend. And it is worth noting nearly 14 million people delivered a stunning election victory to Boris Johnson and his Conservative Party, putting him in power back in December 2019. Yet his fate is now in the hands of some 360 UK lawmakers in Parliament, and at least 54 MPs are not happy and chose to trigger this vote. Well, the move was announced a short time ago by Graham Brady, who heads a committee of Conservative lawmakers. Have a listen.
The threshold of 15% of the parliamentary party seeking a vote of confidence in the Prime Minister has been passed. Therefore, a vote of confidence will take place within the rules of the 1922 committee. That vote will take place this evening in the House of Commons between 6 and 8 o'clock. And we will announce the result shortly thereafter.
Right, Graham Brady runs what's known as the 1922 committee. That is a group composed of all of the Conservative members of Parliament who don't hold a cabinet position. Downing Street says Boris Johnson plans to address the committee next hour. Well, CNN's Bianca Nobilo is standing by for us in Downing Street, and she joins us now live. So, for those who don't understand the sort of machinations of British politics, let's just be quite clear about what happens this evening and why, Bianca.
What we're going to see this evening is the entire of the Conservative Parliamentary Party vote whether or not they have confidence in the Prime Minister. It's as simple as that. Do you or do you not? Now, Boris Johnson requires just more than 50% of his own MPs in order to literally survive this vote, so that would be approximately 180. There are 359 Conservative MPs. It's unclear whether or not one of them will count because they're currently being investigated and going through legal proceedings, but that's what happens tonight. Then after that vote, Graham Brady, who our viewers just heard from, will address those MPs and some journalists and give them the result of that vote. This was triggered because, as you say, 15% of the Conservative Party wrote letters to Graham Brady expressing that they didn't have confidence in the Prime Minister. And the understanding is that this was probably occurring today because the Conservative Party, Graham Brady didn't want to interrupt the Jubilee festivities. So that's why we're seeing this announcement today. The Prime Minister was told yesterday, and the rapidity of this vote from when we knew it was going to occur will probably work in the Prime Minister's favour, because most MPs were back in their constituencies celebrating with their constituents, street parties, having Jubilee parties, and so they've had less time to get together to plot, potentially to be persuaded to vote against Boris Johnson, but also to be persuaded to come back into the fold. And the reason why this is happening now, Becky, is the result of many scandals, but I would say the beginning of these deepest problems for Boris Johnson really did occur through Partygate, and that's because as much as a lot of mischievous behaviour and scandal is priced in with Boris Johnson, it was the perceived hypocrisy and visceral attack that people felt when they found out that the Prime Minister and those within his government were breaking their own COVID rules while people in the United Kingdom were dying or alone and unable to see their loved ones, Becky?
Even if he survives this confidence vote, there is an argument to suggest at this point, isn't there, that his premiership isn't particularly safe. Just explain.
Well, precedent would suggest that even if Boris Johnson did survive the confidence vote, that he's not going to be in a strong position. You know, even if it doesn't wound him terminally this evening and end his premiership, it does inflict a lot of political damage and drains the Prime Minister of authority. Consider the last vote of confidence in a Conservative leader, Theresa May, back in 2018. She won it, and she won it with sort of a reasonable outcome, but then she was gone less than just about 6 months later. And if we look at any of the previous leadership contests, it doesn't spell anything good for the Prime Minister. The best outcome was really John Major, who then went on to lose an election. So the Prime Minister will struggle to get through this, whatever the outcome is. And he'll be in a very difficult position. He already is drained of authority and doesn't command the support of his party. And the crucial aspect is, Becky, is the support that the Prime Minister is lacking is not from one faction like it was years ago with Theresa May and Brexit. It comes from across the board. It's a lot more nuanced, it's nebulous, and it's difficult then to win any particular constituency back because they all have competing interests. So he's now dealing with a very broad and disparate discontent and not from one particular faction, and that is why today is so dangerous.
Bianca's outside number 10, the residence of the Prime Minister, of course. And as Bianca was explaining, what's happening today is a rare event. But let's not forget that Mr Johnson isn't the only Prime Minister who has faced a vote of confidence in the recent past. As Bianca pointed out, Theresa May, Mr Johnson's predecessor, battled against members of the Tories in December 2018. A confidence vote was triggered by members of her own party who disagreed with her handling back then of Brexit. She survived the test. She got 2/3 of the MPs to vote for her. But in the words of one MP, she got a real grilling. Her premiership only lasted for a matter of months after that. She resigned in 2019, giving in to the intense political pressure. Well, that 2018 ballot was blind, as is today's. But some MPs have already come out publicly against the Prime Minister. One letter in particular, we feel, sums up their dissatisfaction with Tory leadership. And I want to take a moment to read some of this. A former ally of Boris Johnson, MP Jesse Norman, emphasising that the Partygate scandal is a major source of chagrin. He accuses the Prime Minister of, quote, casual law-breaking and says for Mr Johnson to describe himself as vindicated is, and I quote Jesse Norman here, grotesque. Norman goes on to say that the UK cannot squander the next 2 years adrift, he said, distracted by endless debate around Johnson's leadership. Well, our next guest has just written an article called We'll Miss Boris If He Goes. Freddie Gray from The Spectator magazine joins us live with his perspective. We'll miss him if he goes. Let's just be quite clear. I mean, he is facing a vote of no confidence. He may survive this, of course.
Well, I think as you've already mentioned, history would suggest he probably won't in the end. I think that what you're seeing at the moment is a Tory party that's eating itself alive. The timing is particularly interesting. I mean, there was thought to be that there would be a moment of unity after the Jubilee weekend and that the government could sort of get behind that and try to move on after a long crisis, the long crisis of COVID and the even longer crisis of Brexit. I think today shows that the Tory party is not in a position to move on, and it will try to destroy Boris, and this crisis won't go away, and it could cripple his premiership forever.
Which would mean what, should he hang on? What would that mean for Britain and its economy at this point?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, public opinion is extremely sour on Boris Johnson. There's no denying that. He has turned things around before. People thought he'd turned it around with his response to the Ukraine crisis. We'll see about that. But he's shown before that he can pull off miraculous recoveries. I don't think he would ever have pulled off anything quite like this if he were to come back from this. So I think it's looking pretty fatal for him at the moment, if not today, if not tonight, or in the next week, in the coming weeks ahead.
Just remind us what happens if he loses this vote? I mean, he could remain as Prime Minister, as I understand it, while a replacement is found in the Tory leadership. Is it clear who that might be?
Well, that's the big problem for those who want to get rid of Boris, is they have no clear alternative. There is no good successor. And that could be Boris's saving grace. However, if he loses tonight, the rumour is he will call for a general election, which again would be a sort of crisis move. And as Thatcher and Theresa May showed, you can survive votes of no confidence, but maybe not for that long.
When you look at this lineup, Rishi Sunak, for example, Liz Truss, I mean, there are another 3 or 4 names in the mix. I think many of our viewers watching this, wherever they are in the world, will be hard-pressed to recognise not just the faces, but the names of any of these, perhaps bar Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. What does this say? I mean, perhaps you've just alluded to this. What does this say about leadership in Britain today?
Well, I think it might suggest that the Tory party are clapped out as an administrative entity. They've been in power for over a decade. There is not a lot of talent on the front bench. They have got through a number of crises, and the people who have survived those crises have done it just by being survivors, not necessarily by being particularly good or effective politicians. Boris has always been the exception, the great talent, the election winner. I don't think you see that in any of the possible alternative leaders.
Was it booze and cake in the end that's done him in, if indeed he goes today?
Do you mean booze? Do you mean booze with a Z or booze yesterday at the weekend?
I'm talking about Partygate, of course.
Partygate. I think Partygate is the sort of above ground reason, but the deep rage in Britain is about the cost of living crisis, and that really informs everything. And a lot of people, I think, would not be angry about Partygate if they weren't really much more angry about the fact that inflation is roaring and the government doesn't seem to have a firm grip on the economic crisis.
Good to have you on, sir. This vote, of course, later on this evening, London time. Stick with CNN for the result of that. Thank you. On to the war in Ukraine now, and an update on what is a fierce battle for Severodonetsk. After reporting notable gains over the weekend, the Ukrainian military chief in the Luhansk region says the situation has, in his words, worsened again. These pictures of destruction in the city from Ukraine's government. The military chief says Russia is focusing most of its shelling on the neighbouring city of Lysychansk, where thousands of civilians do now remain trapped. It's there, among the heavily bombarded places Ukraine's president visited on Sunday on a tour of the front lines. Volodymyr Zelensky met soldiers and internally displaced Ukrainians, offering words of praise after all that they have endured over what is now months of war.
I am proud of everyone I met, shook hands with, communicated with, and supported. Something was brought for the military, but I will not detail it. And I brought something from them to you. It is important. We brought confidence and strength.
Russia's president, meantime, issuing a new warning to the West after the US and UK announced plans to send advanced weapons systems to Ukraine. Have a listen.
In general, all this fuss around additional weapon deliveries, in my opinion, has only one goal: to drag out the armed conflict for as long as possible. If they are supplied, we will draw appropriate conclusions from this and use our own weapons, of which we have enough, in order to strike at those facilities we are not targeting yet.
Ben Wiedemann connecting us today from eastern Ukraine, and perhaps not surprising what we heard from the president speaking to state media in Russia over the weekend. Let's concentrate on what is going on the ground just for the time being. What can you tell us about what's happening around Severodonetsk, Ben?
Well, it seems, Becky, that it's a back-and-forth situation. At the end of last week, Ukrainian officials were conceding that the Russians had taken about 80% of that city. Over the weekend, the Ukrainians launched a counteroffensive in Severodonetsk and were able to take some areas. But this morning, they came out and said that the tide has turned yet again, that they're further, they're on the defensive and losing more ground in that city. In fact, the head of the Luhansk Regional Military Command said that at this point the Russians are using scorched earth tactics, basically blowing up everything they can to try to gain as much control as possible of that town. Surprisingly, President Zelensky came near, we understand, near the town of Luhansk, which I've been there. It overlooks Severodonetsk, to visit the troops. So that's very, very close to the front lines. And certainly you won't find most Western leaders getting that close to the action. And I think that his visit, unannounced of course, really underscores the importance the Ukrainians are putting in the battle that is going on in Severodonetsk and the area around it. Becky?
To address the issue of these long-range missile systems, neither the UK or the US has actually promised missiles that would have a long enough range, they say, to hit Russian targets. But you know, a response from Vladimir Putin over these systems, at least. What do you make of what you heard?
Well, I think many people are interpreting yesterday's strikes, missile strikes on Kyiv, that railway facility, as part of that warning. Kyiv hadn't been hit in weeks. And he's basically saying if the West sends these are high mobility artillery rocket systems that fire artillery from a long range. It's been described with the precision of a sniper rifle. So this would allow them to sort of counterbalance the advantage the Russians have in artillery. Going back to World War II, artillery was one of the main tools in the Russian military, used in an extreme manner. And what they're doing in Severodonetsk and the Donbas region as a whole is really using this artillery, which is not precise. Most of it is not very modern, but it has a hugely destructive effect. And these weapon systems being offered by the West or to be provided by the West might counterbalance that. Becky?
It does seem remarkable that we were alluding to a weapon we used back in World War II. Such is the state of things at present. Thank you, Ben. Meantime, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov won't be going to a scheduled meeting in Belgrade. That is according to Russia's state news agency, which says EU and NATO members that border Serbia closed the only air route into the country. Lavrov says he's invited his Serbian counterpart to Moscow. Well, ahead on the show, a tit-for-tat response from the US and South Korea after Pyongyang launches its latest missile. We'll have more on Seoul's recent change in tone. South Korea and the United States are sending a strong message to Pyongyang about its recent missile launches. The South Korean Joint Chiefs of Staff say that the two countries launched 8 surface-to-surface missiles early on Monday. This is a direct response, we are told, to North Korea's launch of 8 short-range ballistic missiles the day before. CNN's Barbara Starr standing by live from the Pentagon. Let me get you, though, first to Paula Hancock, who is live from Seoul. South Korea responding with its own missile fire 3 times this year. You and I have spoken about a pivot, a change in tone and a pivot by the new South Korean leader. What does this tell us at this point?
Well, Becky, we have heard from South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol that he wants to have a stronger response to North Korea, and this potentially is what we are seeing. It is worth pointing out, though, that back in 2017, we did see his predecessor, Moon Jae-in, do something similar after a North Korean missile launch. But then, of course, he did pivot to engagement and negotiation. So what we're seeing here is really the closest you can get to the meaning of the term tit for tat. On Sunday morning local time, you had North Korea firing 8 short-range ballistic missiles into the sea off the east coast of the peninsula. And then in the early hours of this morning, Monday morning local time, the US and South Korea fired 8 surface-to-surface missiles. Now, what we heard from the South Korean side, the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying that basically the message with this is to tell North Korea that no matter where you fire from, we will be able to target that exact location. Japan's defense minister actually called what North Korea did on Sunday unprecedented because it was 8 separate launches and they were from multiple sites. We understand 4 different locations, according to the South Koreans, over a space of 40 minutes. So this is a new kind of approach from North Korea. So certainly it is concerning the South Koreans. It is concerning those in Tokyo and in Washington as well. And this is what is called a show of force. They want to show that they would be able to target North Korea's abilities if they so desired. Now, of course, the question is, does this make any difference to the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and his assessments? Most would guess no, because he is very much in a testing regime at this point, showing no interest whatsoever in engaging. Becky?
Barbara, thank you. Barbara, the International Atomic Energy Agency, of course, has said that there are signs that North Korea could be preparing for a nuclear test. Tell us more about the US involvement, Washington's involvement in what, as Paula described, tit-for-tat missile launches.
Well, this is something that both sides have done before, the U.S. partnering with the Republic of Korea. And as Paula just points out quite precisely, it's a show of force. It's a message being sent to fire these missiles into the sea. International notification, no risk, very low-key, essentially, but still trying to send a message to North Korea that the Republic of Korea and the United States military can reach out and respond if North Korea was to do something that was needed a military response. So it sends a message. Kim Jong-un not likely to change his mind about anything. And you also saw that shortly after the Republic of Korea and the U.S. conducted their missile firings in response, there was a statement that the U.S. and Japan also conducted a missile defense test. So you're seeing this kind of mood across the region, trying to put a mark on the wall. We're here, we will respond to you, but no indication that Kim may even be listening. Becky?
Paula and Barbara in the house for you. Thank you both. Well, a pivotal moment for Boris Johnson's premiership. The British Prime Minister faces a vote in a matter of hours that could decide whether his 3 years in office will quickly come to an end. More on that after this. Welcome back. I'm Becky Anderson in London. You are watching Connect the World. Boris Johnson's future as Britain's leader could be decided in less than 3 hours from now. The Prime Minister faces a vote of confidence in Parliament later today, triggered by disgruntled members of his own Conservative Party. Mr Johnson is expected to address those members of the voting committee shortly before they make their decision. If more than half vote to oust him, he will be forced to step down as party leader and will be removed from office. Now, all of this comes amid backlash for parties held at Downing Street during the COVID lockdowns and amid growing concern about Johnson's handling of the cost of living crisis. Well, sounds more like the reaction you get from protesters, not revellers. The Prime Minister's unpopularity at times eclipsing even the celebratory crowds during the Queen's 4-day Platinum Jubilee celebrations. You can hear the boos above the sound of bells at St Paul's Cathedral as Johnson arrived for the Thanksgiving service on Friday. Well, Conservative MP Conor Burns joins us now live. He tweeted, "I will vote to support Boris tonight. I watched how broken our politics became in 2019 and was convinced only he could fix it, having won the biggest mandate of any Tory leader since Lady T and got the big calls right. He commands support. The people should be his judge." Well, he joins me now, Conor Burns. The problem is at this point, people can't be his judge. It is his party, and at least 15% of them want to see the back of him. A former ally of Johnson, Mr Burns, MP Jesse Norman, emphasising that the Partygate scandal is a major source of chagrin, accusing the Prime Minister of casual law-breaking, and says Mr Johnson, to describe himself as vindicated, as he did back then, is grotesque. He says that the UK cannot squander the next 2 years adrift, distracted by endless debate around Johnson's leadership. Is he not right, sir? And if not, why not?
Well, look, Jesse Norman is entitled to his view and he's entitled to express it. Jesse, of course, was until very recently a member of the government led by Boris Johnson, and in fact one of the most articulate defenders of the government, its policies and what it's trying to deliver for its vision for the British people. I want to see colleagues tonight supporting the Prime Minister. I think the public are looking on at this and are bewildered that when we have so many challenges going on, the cost of living challenges that's across the Western world, what's going on in the continent of Europe with Ukraine and Russia, that the Tory party appears to be looking inwards at its own leadership. It's only 2 and a bit years since this Prime Minister won a landslide majority at a general election from the British people, the biggest majority since Margaret Thatcher in 1987. If anyone's got the right to dispatch this Prime Minister, it is the British people in a general election.
They don't have that opportunity at this point, do they? Because there isn't a general election on the cards, as it were, for, what, some 18 months. And most polls, with respect, sir, when you look at them, have an approval rating which is pretty dire for this Prime Minister and for the Conservative Party, of which you are a member. Hang on, sir, hang on. Well, hang on. I am working on opinion polls just for the time being because the British public don't have the opportunity to vote at this point.
Let's just elections with respect. And they vote people in for a 5-year period, and then they have a judgment after that 4 or 5 years. And if we'd operated on opinion polls, Margaret Thatcher would have been dispatched in 1981 and in 1986.
And we don't work on opinion polls.
We don't work on opinion polls. Victories.
Hang on. We don't work on opinion polls. You're right. I am just quoting an opinion poll and using it here, but we don't work on those. At this point, the British public don't have an opportunity to vote whether or not they would vote to keep the Conservative Party in or not. It is about what Boris Johnson's own party is doing. Let's just be clear about what Jesse Norman has said, because you're right. This was a key ally of the British Prime Minister who accuses Boris Johnson of casual law-breaking. He says to describe himself as vindicated over Partygate is grotesque. Do you not agree with what Jesse Norman has said?
I agree with what the Prime Minister said when he apologised in a recent statement to the House of Commons and through the House of Commons to the British people some 42 times for failures within the operation in Downing Street, and he's made significant changes to his operation in Number 10. He's appointed new personnel to tighten up the discipline. We accept there were failures through the lockdown period, but there's been no attempt to shy away from that. But what we're talking about today is who is the right person to lead our country, to lead our party, and to take us into the next general election in 2 or so years' time. And I still believe that person is Boris Johnson.
You are talking as a Tory lawmaker about who you believe should take you as a party into the next election. But let's be quite frank, it is bigger than that at this point. And while the British public don't have an opportunity to vote themselves, they are looking to you as a set of lawmakers to decide whether or not the UK, and again, I quote Jesse Norman here, will squander the next 2 years adrift, distracted by, quote, endless debate around Johnson's leadership. You must agree that this endless debate is a distraction, surely, at a time when the UK, as others are dealing with a real cost of living crisis at this point.
And that's exactly the sort of thing that my constituents in Bournemouth are talking to me about. The people I met across the 4 days of the Jubilee weekend when I was in Northern Ireland as a minister, they're talking about the cost of energy bills. They're talking about what the government's massive package of support that we came forward with in the last fortnight means for them. They are not talking about this in the same way that the media want to talk about this. They're talking about what we are doing to help them in their lives and asking us if it's enough. Are we going to ensure that it actually gets to them? There is a whole world out there where people are focused on day-to-day cost of living, getting their kids into the right schools, making sure that the economy is vibrant and creating the jobs that they need for their children to have when they come onto the labour market. Those are the things that the government is focused on. And I totally reject Jesse's assertion that this is a government without an agenda. This government has got an absolute mission, the Prime Minister's defined it, in terms of levelling up, making sure that there are opportunities provided and afforded to communities across the entirety of our United Kingdom.
You watched, you said, how broken British politics had become in 2019 and was convinced only Boris Johnson could fix it. He faces a confidence vote at this point. Are you saying that there is nobody better served at this point to take the reins and to fix what is still a very, very difficult set of decisions to be made for Britain?
What I'm saying to you is that I recall shortly before Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, the Conservative Party had just come 5th in a national election. And within 6 months, Boris Johnson had led us to victory in 2019 with a majority of 80, the biggest landslide for the Conservative Party since Margaret Thatcher a generation ago. And I'm saying that the Prime Minister deserves the opportunity to carry on explaining to the British people what we're doing to improve their laws. He deserves the opportunity to continue implementing that manifesto for which he got a very decisive personal mandate only 2